Sr. came into office is that he and his father, Prescott, had been members of Skull and Bones, this secret society out of Yale, where they tab or pick 15 graduates a year. And there's something for me to say. I was just saying that Skull and Bones, they were graduates, both Prescott and George Herbert Walker Bush, the father that went in before the current president, the one that they call Poppy, that was the director of the CIA. They were both tapped, one in 1919 and the other, I think, at 29. And I think it was something like that. But I mean, anyway, it was the two of them came through Yale and were both tapped there for it. But part of the ritual for Skull and Bones is that you have to go and actually dig up the bones of a historical person and sleep with them in a coffin for the night. And so it's part of a way, like the mafia has you kill someone to make your bones, as they call it. Well, this was their version of a criminal or despicable act that they could also later blackmail the person with. Well, the person that Bush Sr. allegedly dug up, or not him, the Prescott allegedly dug up, was Geronimo. So when the son became president, a special delegation of Apaches came and asked for Geronimo's bones back, to put them back in the grave. Whether they got them or not, I don't know. But
So you were saying how you, one thing I wanted to ask, you've done so much research and really about the JFK assassination especially, you've put yourself out there. Do you ever fear for yourself, or can you tell me about experiences that you've had?
well, I've been surveilled because my mother was 5 levels above top security at the Pentagon. When I came out against the war in Vietnam in '64, and on my college campus in '65, I began to be surveilled by various elements. FBI looked at me, Subversive Activities Control Board, and military intelligence out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. We were like the UD students for an informed campus. That's what we called ourselves. We did silent vigils and tried to educate people at an information table about the war. We didn't have any connection to even a national organization. But I had these guys coming to me in my classes, would come out, walk out of the class and walk over to me, older adult people who were in the classes, and they'd say, you better watch who you're hanging around with. I said, well, who are you talking about and who are you? And finally, when a younger one was in one of my classes and gave me that spiel, I got him to talk to me, and he said that he was with Air Force Intelligence at Wright-Patterson. And I said, well, why are you spying on civilians? The military's not supposed to bother with civilians. Neither the CIA nor the DOD are supposed to have any civilian function like that. And he said, well, we're tracking this group SDS, Students for Democratic Society. And I said, well, we don't have SDS on this campus. And we didn't. And then he told me that they were tracking this guy that founded it, Carl Oglesby. They were tracking him on a map, putting pins in the map. And I told Carl that years later when I met him. And this is '65. I mean, fairly early on, and the Port Huron statement, I think, was either that year or the year before. And they had just barely gotten started, and these guys were all over them, and then they were all over me. My mother, I remember, told me that she was worried she'd lose her security clearance because of my positions. But I just said, why do you want to work for people like that who would fire you because somebody disagrees with them? And not even you, but me. I mean, what kind of a... To me, that was a throwback to the fears that they had in the 50s, of being linked to anybody that had any, left tendencies or red, and everybody around the person is then suspect, and, ruins families and jobs. You lose your jobs over it. I couldn't really get it. I was asked at 15 to work in the Pentagon Library, and even by 15, I had already decided what my political loyalties were, and that I didn't want to be part of the Pentagon. And at age age 10, I got in trouble and sent to the principal's office because I wouldn't hide under this little wooden desk. You know, the little desk that you sit in, that I was supposed to get down and put my head. When they were telling me about an atomic bomb that was going to collapse the roof and blow in the windows, and they wanted me to get down under this desk that has no sides, and this little thing over, like as if the roof caved in and it's not going to knock the desk down on top of me. And I just realized, I mean, I was 10 years old, but I realized these are adults. This is who's supposed to be protecting my life. Not only are they insane because they have this weapon that somehow they would use that would do this kind of damage. I mean, that was unthinkable to me, that they even had such a device, and why would they use it? You know, but then on top of that, they were telling me to do something that wouldn't even protect me in response to it. And to me, it was total insanity. And I just said, I'm not getting under that desk. And years later, I read about Dorothy Day from the Catholic Workers Movement when they tried to make people go down the subway systems in New York en masse as drills for air raids for nuclear bombs in the 50s. And she wouldn't. She sat in Central Park and the police arrested her. And she said, you know, I'm not going down in a hole. You take that bomb off my back. And the next time she came out, she had like 5 people with her, and they got arrested, and then 25, and eventually she brought 5,000 people out into Central Park, and they gave up. They stopped having the air raids. But, you know, I already knew what my leanings were. Now, looking back at it, you know, if I'd had enough political sophistication to go beyond my beliefs, I probably should have taken the job in the Pentagon Library at 15, because I'd know even more than I know now. Because just being left off there by my mother to look through a few things educated me well beyond what any public library could. But I used to make my mother drag me to the libraries when I was a kid. You know, when everybody else was out playing, I was in the library. Or when they'd go on a field trip, I'd hide. Because all that happened on a field trip was that all the boys would, you know, try to push you off a cliff or throw you down the ground. So, you know, I just hid till the bus left, and then I'd go over to the school library and read and study. So I always liked to read and find out about things. And just in my nature, but I didn't get, I mean, there were a few in the 70s when I was doing the anti-war work, there were a few phone threats, but I didn't take them seriously because my attitude was if they were going to kill me, they wouldn't give me advance warning. And, you know, my housemates got worried about it, and I said, look, if someone calls and says they're my friend, they're going to warn me, I said, then tell them that if they're really my friend, then to give me all the details on who it is that's threatening me. And if not, then they're not my friend. Just hang up on them, you know. So, but it was mostly harassment more than anything, you know, direct. They certainly will kill witnesses, but I'm not a direct eyewitness to anything. It's easier to discredit me. I get that question sometimes at the lectures. They say like, well, if this is true, why haven't they killed you? And, you know, I said, well, it's kind of a rude question. I mean, there's probably no other lecturer that ever gets that question. You know, you just to go to the Azalea Society, and they raise their hand at the end of your talk and say, well, why haven't they killed you? But I said the only answer I can come up with is that they leave me alive to discredit me. I'm not that important. I mean, at the most, I think I'd be an amusing bellwether to see what I'm cracking and what I'm not in terms of what they've got hidden. But what threat do I pose to them? I don't have, you know, Mae Brussel used to say if she could fill Yankee Stadium with people to hear her lecture, she wouldn't come. She'd send a tape. I mean, we hardly have an audience, and I had a public talk in 1996 called "Are You Scared Yet?" Phony terrorism, counterterrorism, and the strategy of tension, where I laid out what I had seen watching for 20 years in the government documents, this whole development of terrorism, counterterrorism as the replacement of communism, anti-communism. From the 50s, now that threat was gone, they had to come up with a new threat in order to maintain social hegemony, defend the Pentagon's bloated budget and all its intelligence and secrecy state and all of that. So terrorism suddenly, so now a whole empire is gone, a huge country bigger than ours is gone as a threat, but 6 terrorist groups require that we have a larger budget than we had before. And we're supposed to be more afraid of them than we were of the Soviet Union. And there was even a quote at that spy museum in one of the little films I watched, and they had written it on the wall too, from George Tenet, the current director, saying, you know, we spent years fighting this dragon, and then we slayed the dragon, and 6 or 7 snakes came out instead, all these little snakes, and it's harder to control the snakes than it was the dragon. Well, I mean, I'm sorry, but I just don't quite feel that threatened by all harmless. I mean, not that something like that can't hurt people, but I mean, I also know that in most of the cases where there were any of these international incidents of these bombings and things, I found that the groups involved with them had links to the CIA, and that's true right up to the current situation, that CIA was funding and arming bin Laden, and the Al Qaeda, and the U.S. government paid the Taliban $43 million in 2001 to stop growing opium, and the Northern Alliance began growing it instead, and 80% of the world opium was coming out of there, and that finances covert operations. I often say that one reason that the CIA won't release its budget publicly is it wouldn't cover its operations. They'd have to explain where they really get their money. Intelligence has two functions. One function is to capture and steal history and then put a distorted history in its place. So when they talked yesterday at the beginning of the Spy Museum thing, they said, these intelligence operations, espionage operations have a tremendous impact on history. Or I remember there was an old Ace paperback called Spies Who Made History. Well, that's all spies do, is they make history, and they remake history. And they make history either by covert interventions or more commonly by stealing and then spinning and distorting history. And so when the national security state comes in 48, they lock up our history as a commodity, and we can't get at our own history, and they stop teaching history in schools. Well, I mean, history belongs to the victors, not to the vanquished. It's like we're able now to write the history of the Native Americans because they lost. They don't own their own history. But when you don't own your history, you're a conquered people. So that's one major function, is to destroy or capture existing history and then to rewrite it into a phony propaganda history that aligns with the purposes of the state. It's what Orwell talked about, who was a spy himself. Eric Blair is his name. He was in Indian Imperial Police, and he was a British intelligence agent in the first counterinsurgency war in Burma. And he understood how they distorted the things in 1984, which was originally called 1948 in all the British editions. It didn't change into 84 until it hit American press, Hardcore Press World, in 49, changed the title to 1984. And Winston, the main character in the book, early on tells you that one of his first confusions is he doesn't know what year he lives in. And his work at the Ministry of Truth is to rewrite past history. That's what he says in there. He who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future. And so his job is to go back and rewrite or change the photographs and edit the photographs on old publications so that when you go to look something up in the past, it matches the current propaganda line of the present. Now, they haven't gotten quite that far along here, in toto, but by stealing history, they've gotten at, the ability to find many things. But, you can still clip backwards historically and find out more than you can find out by clipping the current newspapers. So because they weren't covering themselves as well. But that's his job. He has this memory hole. He puts things down the memory hole. And then when he eats lunch, his lunch partner is a guy that works in another section of the Ministry of Truth, and his job is to reduce the number of words in the dictionary. Because if you don't have a word to conceptualize resistance and dissent, then it doesn't exist even as a concept. And so he understood that stuff. The other function that it's had traditionally within the capitalist model is, if you think about it, who were Casey or Donovan or Dulles or these guys? They were investment bankers. So part of the reason to have an intelligence network is first to know where the next shoe is going to fall so you can properly bet on it. Because if you're rich enough and smart enough, you bet every horse in the race. And then you win even if you lose. And that's certainly true in the political races. And that's what they do. They own every horse that's running. So it doesn't matter which one wins because they're all beholden to them. So knowing what was going to happen meant that you could secure your investments. But then the second level is you not only know what's going to happen, you make sure what's going to happen. You make sure where the shoe drops. And that's what the covert operations are about, in part. So, but my main problem is getting any kind of an audience, because the the strict left, the left structuralists and the left intelligentsia, shun me on the grounds that I'm a conspiracy theorist, even though I'm progressive and have a class analysis and have been a grassroots political worker for years. People like Chip Berlay try to link me into the Michigan militia or pretend that I have some kind of a right-wing background or I've been wooed by the right wing. Well, I have nothing to do with the right wing. But the left wing won't let me talk. And so I got a few lectures out in California and a few, in Toronto. But 96, I laid out the whole thing about how they were going to use this phony terrorism that they would set up as an excuse for state repression, and specifically for going to martial law, for militarizing police, for breaking down posse comitatus, for creating much more of a police state. And that's exactly what we're seeing after 9/11. Now, whether they planned 9/11 whole cloth or just took advantage of it when they saw it coming and made the most out of a bad situation, I don't know yet. But they certainly have used it in the way that all of this studies for 20 years said that they would. And they had different scenarios, but the end of all the scenarios is to put power in the hands of the Pentagon, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the National Security Council. And I would contend that who has been running this country since 9/11, running it covertly, but running it and making the decisions. And that came out openly when the airports here in D.C. that were closed down on 9/11 were still closed a month later, and the businessmen here were chomping at the bit because they're losing millions of dollars. And so they were told by the city when they went to complain that wasn't the city's decision, that they had to take it up with the National Security Council. And that's who would make the decision about whether the airports would be open. And you can go around D.C. I mean, military people come out and block off areas of D.C. They don't even consult or tell the local police they're going to do it. And the local police have complained. So decisions are being made even at a more concretized and centralized level than they were prior to 9/11. But I had a young student come to my talk in Seattle at the University of Seattle, and he came down at the end of the talk and he said, "Aren't you afraid to go out in public and talk like this?" And I said, "I'm only afraid that I won't be invited back." So my main problem is getting a forum, and I don't care if they want to threaten me, they can threaten me. I'm beyond that. You can only decide how you're going to live, not how you're going to die. And if they want to kill me, they can kill me from a satellite. So there's nothing I can do to protect myself from it, and I'm not going to live my life around some kind of paranoia about whether I'm going to be killed. I'm going to die anyway. But the choice now is whether you're going to die on your feet or live on your knees. So a lot of people have already died, and a lot more probably will die, unfortunately, unless we really take charge here in this country and make it back into a democracy and get rid of this mess. Because Bush and this crew are going down a nightmare path of genocide that probably will leave 80% of the world's population dead by the end of it. And we can be good Germans and go along with it, or we can do what the German people should have done in 1939, taken the country back and tossed Hitler out on his ear. And we don't have to do that violently. There's still a lot of democratic wiggle room in this country, but there won't be forever. There'll be less and less of it as we go. It'll be harder and harder to change the situation the longer we sit. We're at a crossroads now. So. I mean, my personal, safety has never been a thing, and I have not gotten that many threats, and I've never been, at least to my knowledge, actively physically attacked or anything. But I don't think I'm all that important because I can't get an audience. But I have tried, to do grassroots organizing around it, and I was hoping that COPA could have been visible and gotten out there when we started the coalition in 94 to push for the release of the files and full release. And I thought, well, as the files are released, researchers will find new things. We can show that this process is legitimate, because Posner's book came out the same day that they made the decision to appoint the new committee for the release of the records. And the spin in the papers was the files are open, but the case is closed. And I said, the truth is exactly the opposite. The files are still locked up even to this day. Some of the files are. And the case is open. So I wanted to prove that point by new things that we were finding to show, yes, it's worth opening these things up because we can't get it. I didn't expect that we'd find a document that said, here, go kill Kennedy. But it's already shed light on the whole history of the Bay of Pigs, the whole history of the Cuban Missile Crisis has been rewritten because of what's in there. And there's more to come because nobody's even read all these 6 million documents that have been released so far. So there's more to come. There's a lot of stuff that shows that Garrison was on the right track. Jim Diogenio and Bill Davey have written about that from the new files. And there's a whole new history of Mexico City, and from the very top levels of the CIA, they were running some kind of game to have an Oswald double approach the Soviet Union and Cuban embassy to show that Oswald was trying to get into Cuba 2 weeks before the assassination, so they could blame it on Castro. And Newman's books lays that out. So I was hoping that researchers would send us new documents that they were finding, but we couldn't get anybody to send us a single page. They'd go in, they'd find some interesting document, they would hoard it. You know, it's because they want to be, I solved the Kennedy assassination. This document is in my book, even though it's a public document in a national archive. They don't want to tell anybody about it once they saw it, so they could take credit for, like, you know, the great find. You know, well, so I mean it's frustrating because people should be working with each other and working together, but I mean, we also could never get any press. We didn't even get bad press. We just got no press. You know, and for 3 years we had national conferences that no one would cover. And finally, the 4th year, we got C-SPAN to come over and cover a half-hour pre-conference press meeting. And that's the only coverage we ever got from anybody. They don't cover us when we go to Dallas. Because they don't, I mean, it's too hot. They don't want the real information. They're more than willing to cover some cranks, but they're not going to cover us. You know, because we were doing serious stuff on ballistics and hard medical evidence, historical stuff. And so by not being visible, because I think that the American public as a whole agree with us. And 95% still know that Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy, and it went to the top levels of the government. They don't know the details. They don't know whether Oswald was in the second 6-4 window or not, you know. They don't know that, but they know that something's fishy and that they suspect the government killed him. And actually, I think that the government wants us to suspect that and know that, to frighten us. That it's limited hangout, that they've let us know enough to know that, yeah, we killed him. What do you want to do about it? Kill the president, we can sure as hell kill you, so just get out of our way. But I think if the American people had known that there was a legitimate organization that was trying to get the truth out, that they would have supported it. But it was just never visible.
Why do you think the American people, even though they, most people do believe that there was a conspiracy, and that the official version wasn't what was going on, but why do you think people feel so apathetic?
I don't think it's a case of apathy. I think it's a case of an enforced sense of powerlessness. I think that all of the messages of the society are that you are powerless, and that if you try to assume any kind of power, you'll be punished. That if you stand up for things, you'll be fired or messed with. The vast majority of people follow the pattern of, you know, going to school, getting married, having children, and recycling through that. And when you have a family, it's harder to do things, and it's harder to convince yourself to take any risks when the family's dependent on you financially. And most of the jobs are not situations where people create their own work. Most of the jobs are in corporations or large government agencies, you know, where people are under the thumb of, you know, a fairly concentrated wealth and a reactionary political agenda. So they're not allowed to unionize in most places, you know, and they're afraid to dissent in their job, and they're afraid to lose their income because most people don't know how to support themselves. And so all of that, plus the fact that they aren't educating people, or miseducating, propagandizing, and, you know, the news is little more than entertainment. There's no content. history is an optional topic in the schools. So people have no sense, except they feel that the way things are now is the way they've always been and the way they always will be. And that you can't question that kind of a framework because there isn't any other way they could possibly be. And if you do say, oh no, the world could be completely different, then you're a wild dreamer, because they've never heard of a world that was any different. And so they lose their sense of hope or imagination, or they get the idea that they're powerless. The only choices they're formally allowed to have is these elections that I call the evil of two lessers. Where they and the reality is that the vast majority of people don't vote because they know there's nothing to vote for. There's nothing to vote for. You can vote between one kind of a mess or another kind of a mess, and then but you're never going to be voting for what you actually believe in or what your principles are. You're just voting for the so-called representative, who's not you because they can't. Huge military deficit. I mean, they talk about there being a deficit. I mean, it's the Pentagon. That's what the deficit is. 65% of all the funds that they have any control in Congress to make a decision about go to the military, and more go to the intelligence. On top of that, so there's hardly anything left for social services. So I think it's more that. I think people are disenfranchised. They're frightened. They get in a position where they feel they can't do anything, or they're afraid if they try, that they'll have trouble. And they reinforce that with these programs like Chaos and COINTELPRO, that Ashcroft wants to start COINTELPRO again, by making everybody feel that they're spied on, and that they're going to be harassed. The FBI would go around and intimidate people and talk to their employers, talk to their teachers at school, and basically single them out. And when there were movements, they would infiltrate the movements, and they would bad jacket people, tell lies to one person about another, start fights. Some of them led to killings, actually. Black Panther Party and other places, and do everything they can to knock off anybody who looks like leadership that's an alternative.
About how people feel disenfranchised.
Yeah, that they feel powerless. But I'm saying all these things I think are factors in that, and how misinformed they are. The spin that they get on the news, is that the enemy they're supposed to fear is some guy with a beard in Afghanistan that's a will-o'-the-wisp and can't be caught, could show up any day, and he has supposedly thousands of trained terrorists who are all over the place just waiting for another chance to smash a plane into a building or blow something up. And the only way to deal with that is to consider every possible worst case scenario you can and build a society to lock itself down to prevent it. Well, that's insane. I mean, you can't afford to do it. You can't, practically do it anyway. You can't prevent everything from happening. When are you going to address the problem of why there would be any enemies? When are you going to address the 50 years of covert operations and war and killings of tens of millions of people since the end of World War II directly at the hands of U.S. corporations, U.S. intelligence agencies, and the governments that they propped up, that got us into this situation, that were done in our name without us being consulted about them, and got us into this situation where there's all this hostility in the world. If you don't address despair, if you don't address hopelessness, if all you do is maintain this tremendous concentration of wealth and power at the cost of everybody else in the world, then, of course, you're going to have enemies. And people are going to rise out of that who do violence, and they're going to get sanctioned. But if you turn that around, if you give people the hope back, if you get rid of the despair, if you spread some of the wealth, if you make it possible for people to live, and you treat people decently, and you follow international law instead of refusing to be held by any court for what you do, and you drop this tremendous arrogance, about the rest of the world, then you diminish the capability of people to be violent. They're not going to have any basis. You see that a good example is Ireland and the IRA. 50 years ago, when the British were, had the long history of all the British occupation, how obnoxious they were, the IRA had tremendous social support. But as it came, as it got more violent, the costs of that violence to both sides of the community grew. It and then in addition to that, the conditions changed so that they weren't as oppressive. And now you've got a situation where the IRA is like making public apologies for the people they killed and the violence that they did. And they're at the bargaining table. And that's the root. I mean, is it to make a conscious decision to go in and fix it, and to stop messing with people, because otherwise you go this route, you're going to make more enemies. The people blowing themselves up in Paris and the cafes in the 1990s were the sons of the Algerian freedom fighters that were killed by the French 20 years before. Violence is an endless cycle, and unless you go the other way and restore justice and restore hope and get rid of despair, then you can't get out of that cycle. Well, I mean, you can see that on a family level. I'm not even talking about an international level. If there's a fight in a family, how do you deal with it? You make it into a feud. You make it a feud between neighbors, and like I threw an orange peel in my yard, so I smashed his window. I mean, no. I mean, you have a sense of rule of law and some mediation, some justice. You resolve conflicts. I mean, it's just basic stuff. And just the fact that we have enough weapons to make ourselves into a bully is not a good reason to do so. Just because we can go and intervene in these countries, and the terrible arrogance that we have to tell the Palestinians, well, we won't deal with you unless you get rid of your leader because we don't like it. Excuse me? What would we say if the Palestinians said, let's get rid of George Bush, we're not going to negotiate? I mean, it might be a good idea to get rid of Bush, but what would the American people's reaction be to that? I mean, people would just snort, But we think it's okay to say that to them. And that's what I'm talking about, this mindset that we not only run the world, but have the right to. And make all of its decisions for it. And we'll determine what democracy is. Well, we're in a poor position after January to be telling anybody else in the world how democratic their society is. But I think it's more that people just feel that all they can do is sit back and watch. It's not that they don't care, but they're not given any tools to care with. And they're not given any sense that they could change it. And that's really the hump that we have to get over, because the truth is that the reason they go to all these lengths of spying on us and messing with us is that they're deathly afraid of us. The American people are the last enemy that this system of fascism and corruption has. And the most powerful enemy it has. Because the American people still have the illusion, at least in their mind, that they live in a democracy. And they have the history of that since. And so if they really take it seriously and do what Jefferson and Washington and those guys did, which I'm not talking about an armed revolution, I mean, that was the technology and the understanding at the time. What I'm talking about is what they did is they envisioned their liberation. They envisioned what a democratic or fair society would be. And that's the responsibility of every ensuing generation. Jefferson knew that. He said he wouldn't expect his children to wear a threadbare coat just because it had fitted him and he liked it. He expected the conditions would change and they'd have to get their own coat and get their own system to deal with them. He once said that in order to keep power from accumulating and concretizing again into a mess and tyranny, that there'd probably have to be a revolution every 20 years. Well, we're in the unique position of having enough communication, enough intelligence and enough information and enough wiggle room in terms of options and ways to do things, that we could have a nonviolent revolution. It doesn't have to be violent, which isn't to say that their response in the beginning might not be violent. But King understood that when he took on the Southern racists, and they sent the dogs and they sent the fire hoses. But King's nonviolent response in the face of that and the courage to do that changed the whole debate. And he showed them for what they were, and they weren't pretty, and no one supported them after that. And so we have the option really to just withdraw our sanction, withdraw our support for this mess, and to say this country, this military, this foreign policy, this Pentagon, this State Department, they're ours. They aren't yours. They aren't a few bureaucrats meeting behind a closed door. They're ours. It's our country. All of us. And we can decide. And we're not going to leave that decision up to you because you haven't been doing very well with it. And we're going to decide it based on real information. So we're going to end this national secrecy state, and we're going to have information which is key to the democratic process. And then we're going to make a decision as a people, because the instincts, I believe, of the American people are not bad instincts. And I don't say they'd never make a mistake, but they would fix it. But this system of phony representative democracy is not the way that's going to be fixed. But I think, we're more powerful than any other country. There's no country left in the world that can stand up to this juggernaut. The only thing that's left is the American people. And they have tremendous, tremendous power if they want to realize it. But they've been tricked into thinking that they don't. That they don't know enough, that they don't, they don't understand enough, that they can't make these decisions. And that, I think, is more than apathy the problem.
And your belief in that, and as well as the other researchers, I mean, that's what keeps you guys doing what you do.
Yeah, I can't speak for the whole research community. I don't know where they are, but I think all of us have at least some commitment to getting at the truth, and some sense that democracy was betrayed by the assassination of Kennedy, that it was a terrorist act in the same way that 9/11 was, and that it took a popular decision away from the people. Kennedy was responding to popular movements for civil rights, for an end to the arms race and end to nuclear weapons. He was responding, and the presidents since then haven't. They've been under the thumb of the national security state and the Pentagon, the war makers. But Kennedy was genuine, and he was out from under his father's thumb because his father had gotten ill, and the brothers were taking their cues from the people, and the people sensed that. You can still go into poor homes in the South, especially in the black communities, and who you'll find on the wall is Jesus, Martin Luther King, and the Kennedy brothers. Because they give people a sense of hope. And it doesn't mean that they were saints or should be seen as saints, but they were people that responded to actual conditions and listened to more than just the voices of the rich that were around them, and began to make policy changes in relation to that. And that's what so infuriated and frightened the system about Kennedy, is that he was bucking the CIA. He said he would scatter it to the four winds. He was telling the Pentagon to pull out of Vietnam. He was saying he might end the oil depletion tax allowance, which was $27 billion, real money in 1963, that was financing national elections, just the tax write-offs of the oil companies. And he said he would end that. He was going after the mob. He was pushing racial integration too fast for the Southern Rim. And, he was making changes, and he wasn't listening to the people that thought that they wanted to be in charge of the country. And part of the reason to kill him was to kill our own hope for change. And the same 68 with Robert Kennedy and King, 65 with Malcolm, is they don't want us to have any hope. But our hope doesn't have to reside in some national leader. Our hope should reside in ourselves. And we have all the technology necessary to have a full participatory democracy. We don't have buggy and wagon and horse anymore. We have instant communication, instantaneous communication, and almost instant travel. There's no reason we can't communicate with each other. I mean, we could do that by the 30s when we had radio. And that's what the guy that owned this house sold, was the capability to have an informed democracy, controlled by the people themselves. Which is probably why I ended up here, to clean out that karma. I already worked 35 years against the wars, so I've cleaned up my family's karma of 30 years working for the Pentagon, so now I'm working on this.
Do you want to
Yeah,
cut off now?
probably cut off now, and then, we can, I'm allowed. Tail nonsense, telling about how he wanted to see the fiber optic photos, tapes of Leonardo he's up there. I mean, Marina was there. Marina Oswald. She walked out and stuff. He was speculating about whether Oswald was homosexual, and he had nothing to say, about the government or what the, I mean, he was basically going back to, and that's what he did in the press. He went back to the idea that Oswald was a lone assassin. And someone challenged him on the fact that Oswald didn't seem to have been on the sixth floor, and his response to that was that it was a transcendent moment, that he was killing the President of the United States, so it transcended everything, and he was able to do amazing things like get down to the second floor, So I guess he just, he transcended, like his molecules came apart and he floated down into the second floor without even having to take the stairs of the elevator, which he wasn't on. So
Yeah.
that's kind of nonsense they have, but that's part of the motivation when we started COPA, to have serious researchers and get our agenda out, and also put the juice back into what we